Brooklyn, a gloomy morning. Courtroom 6 was packed. Tense faces, cold lights beaming down on the jury box. Everyone assumed this would be just another trial, accusation, conviction, case closed. But then a voice rang out, shattering the silence. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak on behalf of my mom." All eyes turned to a boy rising from the audience bench. A black boy, just 8 years old. Thin, but his eyes blazed with purpose. In his arms, a thick, worn-out file folder, taped up with strips of colored duct tape. The air in the courtroom froze. Judge Carter frowned, removing her glasses. Prosecutor Maddox smirked, condescending, amused. The jury murmured, confused. A child in the middle of a criminal trial? A child asking to speak among lawyers, judges, and prosecutors? What no one realized was that they were about to witness one of the most legendary turnarounds in Brooklyn's legal history. And that boy, Elijah Owens, would not only defend his mother, but expose a broken system that people had long grown comfortable ignoring. The question was no longer, who's guilty? But rather, does this court have the courage to hear a child out? Her name was Jasmine Owens, a single mother, 20 years without a single day off, running a housing program for low-income families in South Brooklyn. She never took a paycheck, never asked for favors, just held on to an old belief: everyone deserves a roof over their head. Then suddenly everything collapsed. An unannounced audit, a vague financial report, and a cold, sharp charge, embezzling $22,000 from the community fund. No chance to explain. No concrete physical evidence. Just one strange signature on a wire transfer, enough to drag Jasmine into the defendant's seat. The day before the trial, her lawyer walked away, citing inability to pay. The community turned its back. They called her a traitor, a peddler of trust, a hypocrite. Only one person still believed she was innocent and dared to stand in her place: her 8-year-old son, Elijah. The child now brave enough to confront an entire system. Judge Carter leaned back, peering at Elijah over his heavy glasses. "You should be in school, not here." His voice was gentle but laced with warning. At the prosecutor's table, Carl Maddox, famous for his 96% conviction rate, smirked. "Are we watching a heartwarming school play now?" A few neckties in the courtroom chuckled in agreement. Mocking, dismissive. But Elijah didn't lower his head, didn't back down. He placed his folder on the table and looked up. "I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't invited. But I'm the only one who's read every single page. And I remember every dollar my mom ever reported." He wasn't some poor child, not a prop for the jury. He was a spark no one saw coming. And when Elijah spoke his final words, his eyes didn't meet the judge's. They locked straight onto Maddox. "If you really care about justice, you should start by listening." No one in that courtroom knew that Elijah's journey didn't begin in a library or in a classroom, but at a worn-out dinner table in apartment 4B in a low-income housing block. Every evening after a simple dinner, his mother, Jasmine, would spread paperwork across the table. Electric bills, plumbing repair receipts, community fund statements, and a stack of colorful highlighters just for Elijah. His job? Categorize. Blue, expenses. Yellow, income. Purple, documents to review again. A 6-year-old boy, cheeks smudged with pencil dust, eyes glowing with purpose. Because this wasn't just chores. It was time spent working alongside his mother. "We're not rich, baby," she once told him. But transparency is the kind of wealth no one can steal. And from those quiet evenings, Elijah learned something profound. Justice doesn't begin in law books. It begins with the smallest habits, repeated with love and truth. At first, Elijah wasn't looking for anything unusual. He was simply doing what he always did: reviewing, sorting, connecting numbers, like a puzzle game. But then, the pieces stopped fitting. August 12th, $3,500 spent to repair the generator at the community center. But the generator was still the same. Chipped paint, jammed buttons, never even touched. August 16th, $5,000 paid to an external legal consultant. His mother had never heard of the person. Never called, never met. August 20th, $6,000 for a new security system, but the doors still creaked. The cameras blinked red, out of battery. No real invoices. No photos. No service descriptions. Only a series of wire transfers, money disappearing into thin air. Elijah knew something wasn't right. And if no one else was willing to see it, he would, even if he was only 8 years old. Elijah stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly from the weight of the folder. He opened it, not to present, but to ask. Slowly, clearly, I tell you. Mr. Maddox, did you verify where the money went? The courtroom fell silent. Not a breath, not a sound. Carl Maddox, the man famed for his 96% conviction rate, froze. His lips moved, but no answer came out. This 8-year-old boy wasn't asking to challenge. He was asking to reveal a shocking truth. The entire indictment had been built without ever checking the recipients of the funds. No company verification. No registration checks. No investigation into who actually took the money. All it took was the name Jasmine Owens listed as a manager to drag her into court. Elijah didn't need to shout. Just one simple question was enough to crack the first fracture in a wall built on assumption. And through that crack, light began to seep in. Cornered, Maddox let out a dry laugh. Are we really letting a child's emotions steer this courtroom? He straightened his tie, looked up at the judge and added, "This boy doesn't understand the law. He lacks the capacity to comprehend any of this." But Elijah didn't blink. He turned calmly, his voice steady, sharp as a blade. "I don't need to understand all the laws. I just need to point out what's wrong." The words hit the air like a slap across the arrogance in the room. Jurors leaned forward. A few took off their glasses. Pens stopped moving. Elijah didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't cry. Didn't shout. Didn't plead. He simply told the truth, and that calm, unshaken truth unnerved everyone in the courtroom. Because no one had ever taught them what to do when a child isn't fragile, but absolutely right. No one knew that every afternoon after school, Elijah didn't go straight home. He pedaled his bike to an old library tucked away in Bedford-Stuyvesant. There, in a corner on the second floor, sat a woman in her late 60s, Lillian Hart. Snow-white hair, shaky hands, but eyes sharp as a blade. She used to be a legal assistant for 3 of Brooklyn's top law firms. Now, she lived quietly among dusty books and free legal forms for the community. Elijah came to her with one small question. Then 2. Then hours, every single day. She taught him how to read the law like reading a person. How to ask questions that made people expose their own cracks. How to structure files, layer evidence, and build a rebuttal strategy. It was no longer a dinner table game. This was a full-blown legal campaign, crafted by a forgotten woman from a broken system, and a child that system never saw coming. "We don't need to be invited into court," she told him. "We just need to walk in the right way." Elijah unfolded a bundle of papers, carefully wrapped in a plastic sleeve, each corner marked with a red tab. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slow and steady, like each word was a knock on the room's conscience. At the exact time the withdrawal was made, my mom was at an emergency room bedside. August 18th, 2:37 p.m. The system recorded a fund transfer from the housing account. At that exact moment, records from Methodist Hospital showed Jasmine Owens signed in for ER admission with her son, suffering a level 3 asthma attack. She was there from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. She never left the room. Elijah held up the receipt, time-stamped documents, intake signatures, and hallway security footage. Every piece of evidence, a perfect match. The courtroom staggered. You can't sit by your child's hospital bed and simultaneously withdraw funds from an office 10 blocks away. Justice doesn't need fancy words. Just one undeniable truth. They accused a mother while she was fighting for her child's next breath. When the judge asked about the security footage, Prosecutor Maddox replied calmly, "The camera system wasn't operational that day." A cold, clean sentence, delivered like it had been rehearsed. The courtroom fell into silence. But Elijah didn't. He held up his phone and played back a recorded call, his voice clear and steady. "This is Elijah Owens. I'd like to verify the footage from August 18th. On the other end, a security staff member's voice rang out. All cameras were fully functional. If needed, we can provide the footage, free of charge. No malfunctions. No incident reports. Everything was recorded, clear and intact. The truth had always been sitting in the hard drive. No one had asked. No one had cared to. Until a child just picked up the phone. Not with power, but with a question the adults never bothered to ask. Elijah lowered his head slightly, his hands clasped together. Not out of fear, but to steady his voice from trembling. "I didn't study law to beat anyone," he said. "I learned the terms, the analysis, the arguments, the rebuttals, just so I wouldn't have to see my mom cry alone anymore." No one spoke. A courtroom once hardened by indictments, cold logic, and endless objections, suddenly felt small in the face of a love so pure, no one dared to dismiss it. At an age when most kids collected Pokemon cards, Elijah collected bank statements, receipts, hospital records, and letters from community workers. All for one purpose: to keep his mother by his side and protect her dignity from being buried under a crime she didn't commit. Love doesn't need to be understood. It just needs to be proven. And that day, a little boy did just that, with every trembling page in his file. Friday night, Elijah came home from the library just like any other day. He dropped his bag and rushed to the small bookshelf beside the dinner table, where he kept every file from the case. But the drawer was empty. Not just a few missing pages. Everything gone. The thick folder he and Ms. Lillian had spent over a month building, sorting, annotating, vanished like it never existed. He searched the entire house, asked his mother, checked the trash. Nothing. And he understood. This wasn't an accident. Not a gust of wind. Not forgetfulness. Someone had found out he was investigating and acted. Not everyone is willing to let a child expose them in open court, especially not when that child was getting closer and closer to a truth they had buried with power and lies. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. And for the first time, his heart held something beyond love, danger. Elijah wasn't a child who forgot easily. And he definitely wasn't a child who trusted easily either. From the very first moment he found the files missing, he had a feeling and a plan. He had placed a small recording device, a gift from Ms. Lillian, inside the lining of a second binder, an exact replica of the original. Put it back in its usual spot and waited. 2 days later, Elijah played the recording. Amid the sounds of papers being flipped and a door creaking open, a deep, gravelly male voice spoke. "Burn it all. He's just an 8-year-old kid. Who's gonna believe him?" No name. No face. But that voice, Elijah had heard it before. In a courthouse hallway. In a short phone call. There was no more doubt. Someone was afraid of him. Afraid of the truth he carried. Afraid enough to steal. To burn. To erase. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. Elijah was always one step ahead. Late afternoon. Brooklyn skies hung cold and gray. Elijah had just left the library, arms wrapped around freshly reprinted case files. As he crossed the old schoolyard, a man stepped out from a gray car, no front license plate. His voice was low, gravelly, but it sliced through the wind. "You want your mom to stay safe? Stop digging." No direct threat. No physical contact. Just one sentence, heavy enough to crush a child's chest. Elijah stood still. He looked at the man, the way he would study a document, with focus, with intent. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. Inside him, the fear didn't disappear. But the only thing stronger than fear was love. "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice steady as a closing statement. "But you're too late. I've already found what I needed." And he walked away. Alone. Steady, like a small man stepping into his final battlefield. When adults burn files, they think everything vanishes with the smoke. But what they didn't know was that Elijah didn't need paper to remember the truth. He stayed in the library for 3 nights straight. Under the tired glow of yellow lamps, he redrew every chart, every number, every blurred detail etched into his mind. The pencil notes, the red ink smudge on the corner of a receipt, the arrow pointing to a suspicious expense. He even remembered the tremble in his mother's hand as she wrote it. The library's old printer, where he'd once backed up a few rough drafts, became his last lifeline. Not everything was recovered, but enough. Enough to rebuild the logic, map the connections, and resurrect the key evidence. "Want to kill the truth?" Elijah muttered, taping fresh pages back into his folder. "It'll take more than someone you pay to burn paper. You'd have to burn memory too. And my memory isn't stored on paper." The case file was rebuilt. From memory. From will. From a love that refused to surrender. While reconstructing the case file, Elijah noticed a small detail that had once been overlooked. The name of the company receiving the funds, Crescent Solutions, LLC, sounded strangely familiar. He looked up the business registration number and froze. The legal owner of the company was none other than Raymond Tall, the personal assistant to Prosecutor Maddox. Not a third party. Not an administrative error. But someone inside the system turning against the very justice they swore to uphold. Elijah printed everything. The business registration, the address matching Toll's residence, and the trail of anonymous bank transactions. Every line, every number, every truth now had a name, an address, a face. It was no longer a theory. It was conspiracy, collusion, corruption. As Elijah tucked the rebuilt file into a fresh folder, he whispered, "Justice isn't afraid of people who wear masks. It's afraid no one's brave enough to pull them off." And he was ready. For court tomorrow. For the counterattack fueled by evidence. Elijah stood in the center of the courtroom, a spotlight casting his shadow long across the cold tile floor. He looked straight at Prosecutor Maddox, without fear, without flinching. "Mr. Maddox, can you prove my mother signed those transfer orders?" The room fell silent. Maddox adjusted his tie, his voice starting to waver. "The signature matches administratively." Elijah immediately flipped open a comparison chart. No notary stamp. No handwriting analysis. No physical presence verified at the office. And you never checked the building's entry log that day. No one could argue. No rebuttal held. Maddox, the man who had shattered witness after witness, was now being cornered by an 8-year-old child using the very laws he once used to crush the powerless. Elijah didn't scream, didn't boast, didn't try to prove he was brilliant. He only needed to prove his mother wasn't at the scene of a crime that had been built on fiction. Elijah said nothing more. He simply reached into his bag and pulled out a small silver USB drive. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to present this audio recording, legally obtained from a recorded office phone call with automatic disclaimer." He plugged the USB into the courtroom speaker. A soft, static buzz, then a voice rang out, clear, familiar. "Tony, just pin it all on that black woman. Who's going to believe her? We need this case wrapped up before the election, no deep digging." The courtroom erupted. Jurors sat upright. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Judge Carter slammed her pen against the desk. It was Carl Maddox's voice. No more speculation. No more legal gymnastics. This was bias, prejudice, a political calculation laid bare. Elijah didn't need a closing argument. One careless sentence had shattered an entire career, built on manipulation and lies. But Elijah didn't stop there. He opened a black folder, stamped confidential, and calmly pulled out a set of bank statements. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm to the point of chilling, "this is the statement from Crescent Solutions, LLC, the company that received $22,000 from the housing fund." He pointed to a single transaction line. August 21st, exactly 3 days after the funds disappeared. $22,000 was transferred to an account under the name of Carl Maddox. No more speculation. No more gray area. The money trail was now crystal clear, and the final recipient was the prosecutor himself. Maddox went pale. He stammered, "No, that's not possible. That's not my account." Elijah lifted his head, his voice soft, but it thundered through the room. "I verified it. The account number matches your tax filing from last year. You didn't just frame my mother, you stole and used your power to cover it up." The courtroom trembled under a second shockwave. This time, no one dared sit still. Throughout the entire hearing, Jasmine Owens sat in silence. Her hands clenched tightly together, eyes fixed on her son, the boy who had stood in her place to face down an entire system. But when that final bank statement rang out, like a hammer pounding into falsehood, she stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced clean through the thick silence blanketing the courtroom. "I am innocent." A heavy, suffocating pause. Then, her tears fell. "I've spent my life helping families who had nothing but hope. And yet, because I'm a black woman, with no title, no backing, they were willing to destroy my name, like crumpling a piece of paper." No one moved. No one looked away. Because the truth just spoken didn't come from evidence, but from the pain of a mother who had never been allowed to speak. Judge Carter removed his glasses, his hands folding together on the bench. He looked at Elijah, then at Jasmine, and finally at Maddox, now reduced to a trembling shadow of the man he once was. A long silence. Then the verdict rang out, clear as a bell struck through stillness. Ripage defendant Jasmine Owens is fully acquitted of all charges. And this court will forward the case file to the Federal Investigative Committee for inquiry into prosecutorial misconduct and corruption. The gavel dropped. The room exhaled. But no one spoke. Some victories don't erupt. They tremble. Elijah remained still. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply lifted his head, eyes wet, but gaze steady. Because he hadn't come to court to be a hero. He came to restore his mother's name. And today, that name had been cleared by the power of truth. 3 months after the trial that shook Brooklyn, a 9-year-old boy stepped onto the podium in a packed auditorium at NYU Law School. His name was introduced with reverence, Elijah Owens, the youngest honorary speaker in the school's history. No fancy microphone. No tailored suit. Just an old, worn-out folder, and a single sentence that brought the entire room to silence. "I'm not here to teach law. I just want to remind everyone, justice doesn't care how old you are, only whether you are willing to stand up." From that moment, the Elijah Project was born, a program teaching basic legal rights to children in low-income families. In just 6 months, it had reached 25 public schools across Brooklyn. And his mother, Jasmine Owens, was no longer a defendant. She was now the head of the city's Welfare Reform Commission. A new symbol of transparency, of justice, and of trust restored. Carl Maddox was once the golden face of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. A spotless record, a near-perfect conviction rate, and political ambition reaching all the way to the state attorney general's seat. But it was that very ambition that destroyed him. 3 months after the trial, Maddox was sentenced to 6 years in prison for abuse of power, corruption, and obstruction of justice. He lost his position, lost his law license, and worse, lost the honor he once believed untouchable. In a cold prison cell, he wrote a handwritten letter to Elijah and his mother, apologizing, explaining, asking for forgiveness. But Jasmine never replied. Neither did Elijah. Not out of hatred, but because they had moved on into a world where true justice no longer needs to hold a conversation with those who once dismissed it. Some apologies aren't too late. They're simply no longer necessary. At the year-end keynote for the Elijah Project, a young law student asked him, "Weren't you scared? Standing alone against the whole system like that?" Elijah smiled, with eyes that had stared into contempt, into threats, into prejudice, and never wavered. "Of course I was scared," he said. "One that my mom taught me, when you know you're right, you don't bow your head. Even if you are the smallest person in the courtroom, you can still do the biggest thing, keep the truth standing." That sentence, simple as a whisper, left an entire nation silent. No lawyer's robe, no judge's bench, just an 8-year-old boy. A love big enough, and a belief that would not bend. Because sometimes, justice doesn't begin with power. It begins with a school bag and a heart that refuses to accept injustice.